Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. 5 seconds to earn your attention, a silent house, a locked routine, and a single room that doesn't match the rest. Winter light slid across tile in Binningen, just outside Basel. The home was orderly, until the laundry room. There, a sharp chemical tang clung to the drains. Nothing was overturned. Nothing was frantic. The quiet felt arranged. Neighbors reported no disturbance. There's no 911 here. This isn't the States. But the police response was fast and focused. In towns like Binningen, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. And this time, the victim was known by name. Kristina Joksimovic, 38, a former Miss Switzerland finalist and a coach who taught posture, pace, and poise. Investigators treated the residence as a controlled scene from minute one. Doors and hallways were photographed before anyone crossed thresholds. Footpaths were limited to preserve trace. The laundry room became the axis. Drains swabbed, traps pulled, bottles documented. The goal was simple. Locate and isolate transfer, chemical residues, microparticulates, fiber slough, any sign that post-event activity had altered what should have been an ordinary home. In homicide work, the first hours are about eliminating noise. If the scene has been cleaned, chemistry will say so. If tools were used, micro debris will say so. The body, more than any witness, will set the clock. Kristina's identification was straightforward. Her public profile made confirmation fast, but that didn't change procedure. She was documented with the same discipline as any victim: position, lividity, temperature gradients, artifacting, and anything suggestive of manual force. Family photographs on a nearby wall showed a different narrative. Travel, celebration, a carefully tended life. The task wasn't to reconcile those pictures with what happened here. The task was to answer the question every case demands. What is the mechanism of death, and when did it occur? Technicians extended the perimeter to utility access and waste lines. When a room smells like solvents or cleaning agents, plumbing becomes evidence. Trapped contents can hold what surfaces no longer do. Containers are cataloged, capped, and rushed for analysis. Labels matter because mislabeling creates shadows in court. The data must align. And when it aligns too cleanly, when a house looks polished in the exact places that should be messy, that's a red flag. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. By evening, the working posture was clear. This was a suspicious death inside a private residence dated to February 13, 2024. There was no public announcement of a break-in, no stranger narrative released to calm the street. The approach remained tight, forensic, and quiet. The body would speak next, in a room where emotion has no standing and results are read in millimeters and minutes. If you follow series like Dateline or 48 Hours, you know what comes after the scene: the table, the lights, and the examination that narrows possibilities to one. Before we go there, remember the name at the center. Kristina taught people how to move with confidence. Tonight, every movement in this house will be measured by angles, by patterns, by traces that don't care about appearances. This is not about rumor, it's about sequence. Kristina Joksimovic wasn't a mystery to the public. At 38, she coached runway posture and stage presence, a finalist in Miss Switzerland 2007 who still drew attention at events around Basel. Her calendar was organized, her brand consistent, and her social posts in the weeks before February 13, 2024 showed a stable routine. Work sessions, family snapshots, a life that read as normal. That made the house in Binningen more important, not less. When the public image is steady, investigators look for breaks in the private pattern. Missed calls, delayed replies, a canceled class, anything that marks a change in tempo tied to the date of death. The first task after securing the scene was to fix a window of time. Phone activity and messaging habits help, even when content isn't disclosed. Investigators compare typical posting times and response delays against the last verified communication. If someone known for prompt replies goes quiet, that silence becomes a data point. In this case, the silence aligned with the date already on the board, February 13th. The goal was not to read feelings from posts, it was to quantify behavior, when she was active, when she stopped, and whether that gap matched what the scene was already telling us. Victimology matters because it narrows motive and opportunity. Kristina worked with clients on schedule, regular, booked sessions that generate witnesses and timestamps. Those witnesses confirm presence and health in the days leading up to the incident. Their statements, combined with routine check-ins from family logistics, built a picture of a person living a typical week. That baseline is what homicide units rely on. The less chaotic the victim's life, the more any deviation stands out. Here, the deviation wasn't visible in public, it emerged inside the house. Domestic history is reviewed in any unexplained death at home. Press accounts have referenced prior violence involving Christina, including a reported choking incident and head impact assault in the past. In forensic terms, prior non-fatal strangulation is a recognized risk indicator for later lethal events. It isn't a conviction and it isn't a shortcut, it's a documented factor that changes how investigators weigh scenes and statements. You don't need dramatic language for that. You need records, dates, and corroboration. When those elements exist, they become part of the file. Friends and colleagues told reporters she was kind, professional, and consistent with her commitments. Those aren't soft details, they're anchors for the timeline. A person who shows up is a person whose absence can be precisely measured. That's why the calendar and the home must agree. If the schedule shows a standard workday and the home presents chemical masking and controlled cleanup indicators, the conflict is real. In towns like Binningen, murders aren't just crimes, they disrupt systems that usually run on time. School drop-offs, lesson plans, client sessions. Here, disruption pointed inward. Investigators often ask a basic question: who had regular access to the victim's private space? Public access points, gyms, studios, restaurants generate cameras and crowds. Private space narrows the field to family, intimate partners, and invited guests. Switzerland is not the United States, but investigative fundamentals are similar. Establish access, confirm or exclude alibis, test statements against scene data. We're not naming a killer in the first half of this story. We are establishing that the scene inside the residence was not consistent with an accidental or sudden medical event. It read as controlled after the fact. There is a human side to this that doesn't require speculation. Christina was a mother of 2 young daughters. The decision-making around child safety, custody, and interim care moves in parallel with the criminal inquiry. That process is quiet by design. It protects minors while the evidence is examined and while courts consider risk. You can acknowledge that reality without turning it into commentary. It is a fact pattern in cases like this. When violence occurs inside a home, the legal system prioritizes children first. The working theory at this stage was narrow: a suspicious death inside a family residence with indications of post-event handling. The lab work from the laundry room, drain contents, container residues, tool swabs, would either support or challenge that. The next chapter addresses the autopsy. That is where cause of death is fixed, and where any claim of panic or self-defense begins to face measurement. The data needs to align because in court, alignment is stronger than opinion. When the alignment is too neat in only certain rooms, you look closer. When it is consistent across the body and the house, you move forward. The first version of events came from inside the home. It was straightforward on paper. She was found unresponsive. Shock set in. Actions were taken after the fact that should not have been taken. In any suspicious death, investigators document that narrative word for word, seal it in time, and then test it against what the house, the body, and the clock can prove. Tone stays neutral. Sympathy or doubt does not enter the transcript. The only question is alignment. The reporting officer's notes set the baseline. Who discovered the victim? Where in the residence that contact occurred? What was done immediately after? And who else had access? A structured interview follows. First pass, open-ended, then a tighter pass focused on times and tasks. In a home scene, the details are simple and therefore decisive. Doors locked or unlocked, lights on or off, what was moved, washed, or thrown away, what was used to clean and how recently it had been used. The person giving the account may be grieving and disorganized. The scene is not. It records sequence without emotion. Here, the initial narrative referenced panic. It suggested a discovery that triggered poor decisions rather than a plan. That claim carries obvious weight and serious legal consequences if true. It also triggers standard verifications. Do timestamps on routine household systems match the supposed rush of events, or do they show deliberate pacing? Are there purchase histories for supplies that appear in the room? Do neighbors' ordinary routines provide anchors? Car arrivals, garbage day, deliveries within the same time window. Switzerland is not the United States, but the logic is identical. You freeze the story and you freeze the data, then you look for drift. Technicians move through the laundry area with a narrow purpose. Find out if post-event handling actually supports panic or suggests control. A rushed response leaves mess, missed corners, partial efforts. A controlled response shows method, product application where residue concentrates, and time gaps that imply breadth, not frenzy. These are not moral judgments. They are patterns that show up the same way whether the house sits in Binningen or Boston. The interview process runs in parallel with the lab. If the first account says, "I touched this," swabs come back either consistent or not. If it says, "I used that," the object should carry transfer, and the drain should carry remnants in the trap. If the account narrows the time of discovery to a specific hour, call logs, messages, and ordinary household rhythms must bracket that hour realistically. When the timeline is thin, investigators do not fill it in. They go back and ask again, this time with reference points. You said you acted quickly. What does quickly mean here? The goal is not to trap a witness. The goal is to produce a clock everyone can see. As this case advanced past its first day, the weight shifted from words to measurements. The scene suggested order where the account suggested shock. Not proof by itself, never that, but a reason to prioritize chemistry, plumbing pulls, and micro debris on surfaces that are easy to overlook. The more controlled a room appears, the more important it becomes to map contact points, handles, bottle caps, utility cutoffs, anything human hands must manipulate to accomplish cleanup. If the story is panic, those points should be messy. If they are not, that is a lead, not a verdict. Investigators also record what is missing. Panic often leaves phones, clothing, or common items abandoned mid-task. Controlled activity tends to collect those items and park them out of sight or route them through washers, bins, and drains. In a case with a public figure like Kristina Joksimovic, the documentation load is heavier because public interest is immediate. That does not change the method. The file still builds the same way. A dated scene, a fixed account, a lab queue, and a quiet march toward cause and manner. Families deserve the truth to be correct, not fast. By evening, the first account stood as one element among many. It would not be the last version told in this case. But even at this stage, investigators had what they needed to proceed. A suspicious death inside a private residence, a narrative of panic, and a room that told its own story in residue and sequence. The next step was not argument, it was autopsy. Cause of death answers questions that 1,000 words cannot, and it anchors the rest of the file to something that does not change with retelling. A brief word on respect. True crime should not reward speculation, it should teach recognition. How sequence, not noise, reveals what happened. Behind every file there is a name and a family that has to keep going. Presenting the facts cleanly is not cold, it is responsible. It is how communities learn from what went wrong without sensationalizing what cannot be undone. The table does not guess, it measures. When Kristina Joksimovic arrived for postmortem examination, the priority was to fix two things that do not depend on anyone's memory: cause of death and a credible time window. That is the pivot in every homicide file. It either stabilizes an early account or it breaks it. Identification protocols were routine and respectful. With that confirmed, the pathologist documented external findings, photographs, measurements, and patterned marks before any internal work began. The initial survey told a clear story. The injuries centered on the neck and adjacent soft tissue. There was no compatible pattern for an accidental collapse or sudden medical event. What the exam did show was classic for manual force to the airway and surrounding structures. No embellishment is needed. The language is simple and formal. Cause of death: strangulation. Internal examination supported what the surface implied. Hemorrhage in the soft tissues of the neck and petechial findings, tiny pinpoint hemorrhages consistent with asphyxial processes, were documented as expected in this mechanism. The examiner logged these observations with attention to symmetry, depth, and distribution. This is not for drama. It is so that later, in court, each point can be matched to a photograph and a line in the report. When a case draws public attention, that discipline matters even more. Facts need to stand on their own when everything else turns loud. Next came timing. Establishing time of death is rarely a single number. It is a range built from converging indicators, body temperature trends, fixed lividity, rigor progression, and situational factors like ambient room conditions. In a residence, environmental stability helps. Heating systems make the math cleaner than an outdoor scene would. By the end of the session, the examiner could place death within a window that aligned with the date the scene team had already locked. February 13th, 2024. That window is not a guess. It's a corridor the narrative must pass through to remain credible. Toxicology was drawn and logged. In a domestic scene that later raises claims about states of mind, intoxicants, or incapacitation, Tox does two things. First, it rules out alternative medical explanations. Second, it provides context, if present, that might explain why a victim did or did not mount a strong defense. Results take time, and they are not the headline here. The headline is the mechanism of death already fixed by anatomy. Toxicology can clarify details. It does not rewrite strangulation. Defensive injury analysis was limited to what the body presented. Scratches on an assailant, if any, are documented elsewhere. Here, the question was whether Christina displayed the kind of patterned wounds that suggest a two-sided struggle typical of a sudden mutual fight. The record did not restore a struggle consistent with self-preservation overcoming an aggressor. That matters because later statements sometimes lean on spontaneous combat to justify force. The body offers a sober counterweight. It tells you if the violence looked like a brief exchange or a concentrated controlling act. This looked like control. Timing and mechanism, when placed beside the residence, add weight to the file. The laundry room work you heard about earlier was not for narrative effect. It was to preserve the very residues that post-mortem examination would expect to see if a body had been handled after death. That alignment, body to house, house to body, is where cases become sturdy. It also tests early claims. A person might describe panic. The evidence now had a fixed center line. Strangulation, not medical collapse. A defined window, not a foggy night. Findings that fit a directed assault more than a sudden accident. There is a human reality in the room that does not need many words. Christina was a mother and a known professional in Swiss media circles. Her families, biological and chosen, deserve accuracy. That's what an autopsy provides. Not speculation about character, not argument about who loved whom more, but the facts of what happened to a body. Respect, in this setting, is clarity. From an investigative perspective, this is the moment where priorities shift. With cause of death established, teams look again at statements, access, and behavior after the moment of death. Did anyone act in a way that suggests concealment rather than shock? Are timelines consistent with a person discovering a tragedy or with a person working through steps to manage exposure? Switzerland's process is methodical. A fixed COD gives prosecutors and judges a foundation to evaluate detention, risk, and the need to preserve evidence without interference. This also sets expectations for the next phase of our story. There will be a later admission in this case and a claim of self-defense, points already reported publicly. Those will be weighed against what the anatomy shows and what the scene preserves. The order matters. First the body, then the narrative. That is how you keep a case from turning into two stories at once. When the autopsy fixed cause of death as strangulation, interviews resumed with a different weight. The earlier version, panic after discovery, had been recorded. Now a new statement entered the file, an admission that Christina Joksimovic was killed, paired with a self-defense claim. The change wasn't treated as drama. It was processed like any other piece of evidence, transcribed, time-stamped, and measured against what the body and the house already showed. Self-defense is not a feeling, it's a set of conditions. Investigators asked for sequence, not emotion. Who initiated contact? Where it started in the home? What words, if any, preceded the force? Which objects were touched, moved, or used? The goal was to map this fresh account onto fixed points. The injuries to Christina's neck, the absence of a two-sided struggle on her body, the focused activity in the laundry area, and the time window anchored to February 13, 2024 in Binningen. If the statement could not coexist with those anchors, it would remain a claim, not a correction. The new narrative described a confrontation that escalated suddenly. That's common in second accounts. People try to narrow responsibility to an instant, but the anatomy didn't align with a brief exchange. Manual strangulation is sustained force. The distribution of hemorrhage, documented by the pathologist, indicated pressure long enough to overcome resistance, not a momentary reflex. In cases where mutual combat is real, you expect defensive marks, displacement in surrounding rooms, and noise in the scene that shows loss of control. Here, the house read as controlled after the fact. That's not compatible with a flash event that ends in shock. With an admission on record, the focus shifted to post-event behavior. Claims of panic were tested against the steps taken in the laundry room. Controlled cleanup implies time, choices, and movement that do not fit a person who has just defended themselves from immediate harm. It suggests a person working a problem. Investigators compared the second account's timeline to routine triggers in any home. Appliance cycles, disposal habits, product usage, and interactions that would normally happen after a crisis. Calls, knocks, neighbors noticing something off. The quieter the neighborhood record, the more attention the controlled room received. There was also the issue of consistency with prior history. Press reports had already referenced earlier violence toward Christina, including a choking incident in the past. That doesn't prove the current act, but it informs probability. When a self-defense claim appears after an autopsy establishes strangulation, a documented history of similar conduct reduces the claim's credibility. Courts don't need a storyteller here. They need the pattern and the dates. Switzerland's process is conservative by design. An admission does not end the case. It reorganizes it. Prosecutors evaluate whether detention should continue, weighing seriousness, risk of interference, and the need to prevent pressure on witnesses. In this file, the forensic picture and the nature of the post-event handling supported continued custody. Later, a higher court would review detention and decline to release. That doesn't declare guilt. It acknowledges that the facts, the body, the scene, the changing statements, warrant restraint while the state prepares charges. There's a human cost beneath the legal posture. Christina's name isn't just the header on a report. She taught clients to walk with confidence. She cared for 2 daughters who deserved routine and safety. When a second account arrives framed as self-protection, it lands in a community that has already seen the autopsy summary. People know the difference between a sudden fight and controlled domination. They live with partners, raise children, and understand how homes usually look after real emergencies. You don't need to sensationalize that. You just need to tell the truth cleanly. This is where narrative discipline matters for us too. We are not building a second story. We are following one line from scene to lab to statement. The admission exists. The self-defense claim exists. Both now sit beside a cause of death that is not negotiable. The file moves forward on that alignment, not on speculation. And for anyone who has been close to cycles of control, the point is practical. Patterns escalate. If prior strangulation was present, it was not a warning sign in theory. It was a forecast that should have triggered distance and help. The next step returns to the house. Post-event handling isn't a footnote here. It's a signal. Tools, containers, residues, and drains are going to tell whether the second account can survive contact with physical reality. If a person felt endangered, the minutes after would look different. Calls first, help first, preservation first. What the team documented instead pointed to concealment. We'll walk that evidence one module at a time, not to shock, but to show how small facts add up until there's nowhere left for a false narrative to stand. Before we move, a moment of respect. Cases like this are watched by families who have lived through versions of the same fear. The value of true crime is not outrage, it is recognition and prevention. If you see patterns that look like this in someone you know, encourage documentation, safe planning, and professional help. Quiet intervention can save a life long before a courtroom ever sees a file. With a fixed cause of death, the file turned back to the house. Claims had shifted, the evidence hadn't. Investigators broke the work into 3 clean lanes, tools, residues, and drains, because each lane answers a different question about intent and time. The tools came first. Items capable of cutting or disassembly were photographed where they sat, then bagged and sealed. Surfaces that looked recently handled, grip areas, switches, blade housings, were swabbed. No drama, just contact and transfer. Technicians logged dimensions and condition because small defects on a tool can leave small signatures on material it touches later. When results returned, what mattered wasn't a spectacle but a match. These were the kinds of tools authorities had described publicly, and they bore traces consistent with post-event handling inside the Binningen residence. That doesn't prove motive, it proves sequence. Someone continued to act after Kristina Joksimovic was already gone. Residues were next. Bottles in the laundry area were indexed, caps tested, and worktops checked for product film. The room read as recently treated. If a person experiences a true emergency, they rarely deliver a spotless workspace. Here, surfaces told a different story: measured application, time to wipe and rewipe, attention to the very zones investigators routinely test. Chemistry answered the question people argue about on talk shows without evidence. Was this panic or planning? The pattern leaned toward planning. You don't have to say it loudly. The residue map says it with quiet confidence. The drains are where many cases stumble or stand. Trap pulls preserve what towels and wipes erase. Technicians removed and capped the traps, then sent contents for analysis. The report language stays careful on purpose. Biological material consistent with human origin. Chemical constituents consistent with strong cleaning agents. You don't oversell what the lab says. You read it as written. When combined with the tool findings and the surface work, those drain results placed controlled after-death activity in the very room that had announced itself on day one. If the second account asks for self-defense grace, this is where that request meets physics. Steps were taken that are hard to reconcile with immediate fear and first aid. Digital points live in the background here, not as headlines but as brackets. Household rhythms, cycles, timers, and routine device pings provided time cues that sat neatly beside the tool and chemistry timelines. That alignment matters because the more you can stack across methods, the less any single method has to carry alone. One good alignment beats 5 loud theories. In a case that will face scrutiny, the prosecutor's future question is simple. Do the house, the body, and the clock agree? In this lane, they did. Investigators also documented absence. There was no evidence of the kind of chaos you see when someone performs real, time-pressured aid. There was no neighbor-verified commotion that would make sense after a fight for survival. Instead, the file filled with choices: objects retrieved, agents used, drains engaged, surfaces addressed. That is not a character judgment. It is a list of acts that took minutes that could have gone to seeking help. In towns like Binningen, people know how quickly alarms travel through a neighborhood. Silence can be information. All of this sits beside what autopsy has already stabilized. Strangulation is not a momentary reflex, it is sustained force. Post-event handling is not an involuntary spasm, it is a sequence of decisions. When those two truths meet in one room, the narrative options narrow. A later admission paired with a self-defense claim must pass through this module without tearing. Here, the tearing happened at the edges first, where blades were held, where product was poured, where a trap kept what a towel did not. There's a human reason for this level of precision. Kristina's family deserves clarity that survives coverage and comment. Precision is respect. And for anyone listening who has lived near controlled harm, this is the pattern that advocates warn about. Hands that take control don't always release it when the worst is over. Recognition saves lives earlier than any courtroom can. Outside the tape, the story looked polished. Kristina Joksimovic was a visible name in Switzerland. Miss Switzerland finalist in 2007, a coach who taught posture and confidence. Photos from weeks before February 13, 2024 showed travel, family moments, and a comfortable home in Binningen. That feed built an assumption: stable, safe, ordinary. Investigators do not weigh a case by photos. They measure routine against evidence. In this file, public image and private risk diverged in the same place: the house. Once cause of death was fixed as strangulation, and the laundry room sequence pointed to post-event handling, the focus widened to impact. 2 children had to be protected at once. Swiss authorities move quickly and quietly in that situation. Interim care is arranged. Contact boundaries are set. Professionals document needs without broadcasting details. None of that decides guilt. It prevents secondary harm while the criminal case develops. In towns like Binningen, people notice when school schedules change and doors stay shut. Silence becomes part of the record because it reflects how far a single act reaches. Friends and colleagues describe Kristina as punctual, kind, and steady with her commitments. Those statements carried weight earlier in building the timeline. They mattered here for another reason. Communities process violent loss in two layers: grief and vigilance. The grief is obvious, the vigilance is practical. People ask what was missed and how to recognize it next time. Prior reports had already flagged non-fatal strangulation in the relationship, a known risk factor in domestic homicide work. That history does not replace proof, but it changes how institutions respond once violence is confirmed. Training exists for a reason. Patterns escalate. Public attention brought pressure, and still the case file stayed narrow. No dramatic updates were released, no invented milestones to satisfy a news cycle. Yeah, the detail that mattered was already in the record. Cause of death, the house sequence, the second statement with a self-defense claim, and a custody posture designed to prevent interference. Later legal reviews, including detention decisions, would lean on those facts. For a viewer, the lesson is plain. Optics distract, sequence decides. This section also belongs to the people who knew Christina beyond headlines. A former Miss Switzerland, Krista Rigozzi, publicly mourned her, focusing on the children left behind. That kind of comment is not evidence. It is context for harm. When a homicide occurs inside a home, the circle of damage includes classrooms, workplaces, and extended families. Responsible storytelling acknowledges that without turning it into spectacle. Respect here is accuracy, not volume. There is a reason we avoided turning the narrative into two competing stories. The temptation is always there. One version driven by public images and another driven by the lab. Keeping a single line prevents confusion later when the court weighs detention and ultimately charges. As of the current timeline, the findings you've already heard guide the posture: strangulation as cause of death, controlled activity after death in the residence, an admission paired with a self-defense claim tested against those anchors, and child safety steps moving in parallel. Nothing in this section changes those pillars. It shows their human cost. If you watch true crime for recognition rather than shock, this is the most actionable point in the series. Where image and risk conflict, trust the measurable, document incidents, encourage safe planning, push for trained help. Prevention lives in small, early choices long before an evidence team seals a door. This case was never two stories. It began and ends on the same line. Christina Joksimovic, 38, died by strangulation inside her home in Binningen on February 13, 2024. The house recorded what happened next, controlled post-event handling in the laundry room, while statements evolved from panic after discovery to an admission paired with a self-defense claim. Autopsy findings in the scene did not support a sudden mutual fight. Sequence beat narrative. Swiss prosecutors moved on that alignment. Judges kept the primary person of interest in pretrial detention. On review in September 2024, release was denied, not as a verdict, but to protect evidence and witnesses in a high-risk, intimate partner homicide. As of October 5, 2025, publicly available reporting does not show a final conviction. The file remains under judicial control, anchored by the same facts that set the course on day one. What matters about the public image, travel photos, a polished feed, a life that looks steady, is that it never outweighed the measurable, the body, the house, and the clock agreed. That is why the detention posture held, and why the case stayed on a single track without sensational detours or a second ending. There is a human center here that deserves more than headlines. Christina was a mother and a mentor who taught people to carry themselves with confidence. 2 children lost a parent. A community learned how limited pictures are as evidence. If this story has value beyond the courtroom, it is practical. Prior non-fatal strangulation in a relationship is a known lethality warning. When it appears, document it, plan for safety, and reach trained help early. Prevention is not a speech, it's a series of small, timely actions. We close where the record stands. Cause of death fixed. Post-event activity established. An admission on paper, tested and found wanting against anatomy and sequence. Detention maintained. Release denied in September 2024. Status pretrial as of October 5, 2025. No twist, no drift. One case, one line, told cleanly for Christina and for the people who must live with what was done. I've told this case the same way I work one. Follow the evidence, protect the living, and never mistake a perfect photo for a safe home. If you see the warning signs, control prior choking, document, reach out, and put kids first. Justice is slow, but truth holds. What did this story teach you about recognizing risk? Do you agree with how the courts handled detention? Tell me where you're watching from, or why this didn't land for you. If this video helped or moved you, please subscribe to Creepy Crime Story and join us for the next case. Your voice keeps this work honest.